2.1 The Communication with the Deceased. Javier's alleged mediumistic experiences started around the age of 5 when he claimed to see and have conversations with his deceased mother. As Javier described, in 1915, I would often see my deceased mother in the backyard of the house I used to live in, but other people could not understand my visions and thought I was lying or suffering from mental perturbation. This behavior is illustrated by the punishments applied by his godmother when he was little, for she would take the ghosts as devil's work. At the age of 9, during elementary school, he would also contact deceased people, making him a constant target for bullying. Since very early, I would see myself surrounded by deceased people. During class, I would often hear voices or feel hands on top of mine, live hands guiding my writing. However, no one else could see or hear them, making me feel very embarrassed. At home, his family would not welcome his visions either. Roman Catholic by religion, they often contradicted Javier's claims and threatened to put him in a psychiatric hospital. Sebastião Scarzelli, a priest to whom Javier confessed his sins at the time, intervened and told the family the boy was hallucinating and should be kept away from books and magazines, which were assumed to be the cause of his mental issues. Following the priest's recommendation, Javier's father burned all his son's prints and put him to work in a clothing factory. Things started to change in 1927 when one of his sisters had symptoms of a mental disorder, and doctors could not cure her with allopathic medicine. Helpless, the family decided to rely on alternative approaches, asking help from some followers of Allan Kardec's ideas, Spiritism. Through prayers and passes, Javier's sister recovered, arousing the interest of Javier and his brother in Spiritism. They became very fond of the new ideas and, in the same year, founded the Luis Gonzaga Spiritist Center, the first one in the small town. The change was positive for Javier, for his relation with the invisible came to be accepted in this new space, and his visions were understood as mediumship. At the age of 17, he started practicing psychography to receive written messages from deceased people. When I write psychographically, I see, hear, and feel the disembodied spirit who is working by my arm, and, many times, I register the presence of the communicator without taking any knowledge of the material on which he is writing. During these episodes, Javier would hold a pencil in his right hand over a blank sheet of paper and place his left hand over his eyes. After a few moments of silence, his hand would glide over the paper continuously with such speed that a helper was required to switch to a blank sheet of paper. When psychographing alone, he changed the sheets of paper with his right hand, as shown in his biographical film. Phenomena like these would occur during public sessions or in restricted sessions containing only a few people. In some situations, he managed to maintain apparent independence between psychography and his attention to something external. Dr. Melo Teixeira, who observed Xavier's activity in the 1940s, reports that his quick right hand glided across the paper in a purely automatic mechanical movement, while he, Chico Javier, in perfect lucidity, could respond to one or another accidental interpolation without interrupting the writing of what he elaborated. Also, according to Dr. Teixeira, instant writing did not depend on the nature of the text. Prose, poetry, philosophy, and history were all written one after the other, continuously. A sonnet would take him a minute to compose. Remarkably, Javier also psychographed texts in English, Spanish, Italian, Hebrew, and Braille, among other languages, although he did not master any of them. He also psychographed backward messages in English, a type of writing readable using a mirror. In 1931, a spirit called Emmanuel supposedly appeared to Javier and offered help supervising his work if he promised to be extremely organized and focused. In Emmanuel's words, there would be 3 rules to accomplish this task: discipline, discipline, and discipline. After psychographing dozens of poems attributed to several deceased Brazilian and Portuguese poets in the following year, Javier published his first book, Poetry from Beyond the Grave, 1932. At that time, Javier was only 22 years old and already suffered the symptoms of his eye illness. Throughout his life, he published around 500 books, including dissertations, poetry, novels, short stories, chronicles, letters, and children's literature, all attributed to deceased people. His most successful work, No Solar, Life in the Spirit World, 1944, translated into 15 languages, has sold over 2.5 million copies and was adapted for film in 2010. These hundreds of books, along with thousands of letters, demonstrate that the primary and most notable form of alleged communication with the deceased was through psychography. But Javier could also use his voice and spoke on behalf of the deceased, a practice known as psychophony, whereby his facial expression, tone of voice, and speech cadence would change according to the communicator. Those episodes mainly occurred in the mid-1950s, when he would go into a trance state at the end of seances and produce a spoken message attributed to a deceased. In other cases, Javier would concentrate and tell people what he could apprehend from the invisible world while lucid. He would provide names and describe objective situations as if he were watching a film. The messages were mainly dissertations, reports, and poems, all recorded by witnesses and later compiled into 2 books, Psychophonic Instructions, 1956, and Voices from the Great Beyond, 1974. Besides psychography and psychophony, Javier was also able to produce materializations of spirits and objects, as described in some of his biographies. However, Javier decided to stop holding this type of act, which, because of its spectacular nature, gained great press and attracted hundreds of curious people. According to his spiritual mentor Emmanuel, his mission would be to write the books, not produce the materializations, because the influence of the books would reach a greater number of people and more efficiently spread the spiritist ideas of charity and benevolence. While Javier's mediumistic writing contained a significant body of remarkably accurate information, the medium himself recognized that mediumship is an imperfect means of communication, because he would be only a translator for the communicators. Depending on various factors, the text could be more or less faithful to the intended message. In 1931, for instance, the spirit of the famous Brazilian poet Augusto dos Anjos supposedly appeared to Javier when he was watering some garlic beds. The spirit of the deceased poet required Javier's attention, so he could get acquainted with the vocabulary of a poem the spirit would later recite, so that Javier could psychograph it more easily. The poem was Voices of a Shadow, published in his first book, Poetry from Beyond the Grave, 1932. As Javier described, Augusto dos Anjos, started talking with those wonderful technical words. I, holding the watering can, found it difficult to understand. And he talked and talked, saying that he liked to ride in the field, and that was the time he wanted to dictate so that I could hear and understand when writing later. As I struggled to understand his words, the poet said, "Look, do you want to know something? I'll write whatever I can because your head can't really take it. And the poem in the book represents the best I could have done, but it was much, much more. It was beautiful." He spoke of photons, colors, worlds, galaxies. Who was I to understand all those things? Me, who was watering the garlic beds?